All right. So to introduce Dr. Saxe, Jennie Perey Saxe is an assistant professor at the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering and one of my favorite professors I had as an undergrad. She received her BS-PH from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and her master's and PhD from the University of Delaware. Dr. Saxe joined the faculty at the University of Delaware in 2017 after nearly 14 years with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Mid-Atlantic office. In her time with the US EPA, she served in positions spanning water programs, sustainability, communications, and government affairs. Dr. Saxe is primarily focused on undergraduate instruction, teaching classes on engineering communication, solid waste management, air pollution control, industrial ecology, and more. In addition to infusing her public sector experience into her classes, she also draws on lessons learned from her experience as an ASCE Exceed Teaching Fellow. Stakeholder engagement and environmental justice issues are critical issues for civil and environmental engineers, and these topics are woven into Dr. Saxe's courses and into her research portfolio. And so at this time, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Saxe, and welcome, and we can get started.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction, Nikki. I'm really thrilled to be here. I am going to, I should be able to share my screen. Yes, hopefully. Let me see if I can do that. There we go. All right, is everyone seeing PowerPoint up on your screen? Excellent, yes. It works. It's always nice when it works on the first try. So again, Nikki, thank you for the introduction and thank you for the invitation to be here tonight. I'm really thrilled to be part of this workshop series. I've been looking back at the speakers that you had, and Nikki was telling me a little bit about the speakers you've had so far. I mean, bringing in elected officials, bringing in journalists, bringing in attorneys focusing on environmental justice issues, you are getting like a nice kind of rounding out of the environment, no pun, that you will be going out into when you go out into the world, because there is policy in environmental engineering. The law is involved, politics are involved. So it's nice to get exposed to these things while you're still a graduate student. So there is, not to project my experience onto you, but there is like a little seed of things that I wish I knew when I was a graduate student kind of embedded into this presentation. So I was, as you rightfully are, very laser focused on the research that I was doing. I took a policy course as a graduate student and I was like, yeah, this is nice, okay. And then I went to work for the EPA and I went, oh my goodness, I was not adequately prepared for this world of issues that I was walking into that are kind of surrounding the practice of environmental engineering. So it's never too early to start thinking about those broader implications of what you're doing and how the work that you're doing affects real people, and how to get your research findings out into the world and into the hands and the minds of the people that you want to have it. So that's kind of the theme of my presentation tonight, building bridges to shared understanding. So I worked in, a little bit of a civil engineering aspect to this title, but shared understanding, that is the goal of communication. Okay, I think you know something, right? As researchers, as students, you want someone else to know it too. You want to come to a place where you have a shared understanding of that issue and of that topic. Okay, so that's kind of the theme. How can we build those bridges? How can you get your research out broadly into the world? And how can you think about communicating with those people that your research may impact? So let's start by I'm calling this an etymological journey kind of through the title of the presentation. Okay? So we're talking about engineering. What's an engineer? If we go back to the early 15th century, an engineer was an inventor or a designer. So that's kind of inspirational. Civil, right? Civil engineering, from civilis, relating to society, pertaining to public life, befitting of a citizen. And the environment, we know what that is. That's where we live, where a thing exists, all of those conditions around where you are living or existing. And that can include your built environment, that can include your natural environment. So when we put it together, go to ASCE for this definition. What is civil engineering? Civil engineers design, build, and maintain the foundation for a modern society. So that's our roads and bridges, our drinking water, energy systems, seaports, airports. I'm going to throw canals in there based on what we've seen over the past week or so. Throw canals in there. So just to name a few things that civil engineers do, and environmental engineers kind of nested in there with civil engineering. So it's putting it all together. And if we then take a step back and we think about the definitions of these terms, right? Engineers are designing and building and inventing. We're doing this to benefit society. And we're doing it in a way that affects our surroundings, our natural surroundings, our built environment. When you put all of that together, that's a huge responsibility. Civil and environmental engineers have huge obligations to citizens, and citizens are stakeholders in civil and environmental engineering projects. They have a stake in the project. That project may impact them in some way. So it's important that we find a way to communicate with those stakeholders. So this is options for engaging stakeholders, kind of looking around, kind of what's the typical practice? How does this usually happen? And here's one path. Okay, so a road, a highway system is built. At some point after that, there's a realization, wow, air quality within this region around the highway has been impacted by this additional vehicle traffic. That results in negative effects on the community living near that highway. Okay, so this is not too far from where I live, I-95 going through Chester, Pennsylvania. That highway was built to connect the East Coast. It split the community of Chester in two. Part of the community is on one side of the highway, the other part is on the other side of the highway. There's I don't know if any of your speakers talked about the Tampa Bay Next project. So there are environmental justice concerns associated with the impact of that proposed highway in Tampa Bay on the community that lives in that region. Okay? And it might not just be air quality, even though air quality is significant. It could be just the fact that a neighborhood is now bisected by a highway. It could be the reduced property values that come with living near a highway. So this is kind of the common scenario. See it play out again and again and again. But is there a different way? Is there a better way to do this? Because that model, really, it's taking the idea of needing a highway, telling the citizens, telling the stakeholders, we're building this highway, and the citizens, the stakeholders, the residents don't have a lot of input into that project. It's very kind of paternalistic, it's very technocratic, it's someone that thinks that this is the best solution for a problem, and really the people that are going to bear the brunt of that impact don't have a whole lot of input. So let's think about a different way. Is there a different way that we can do this? There is. So instead of just starting off and saying, we need a highway to solve this problem, what if you were to do a needs assessment? Okay, and you find out that there's a need for rapid, affordable transportation. And then you reach out and you say, who are the stakeholders in this project? Who would be interested in the results of this need assessment? Let's talk to them, okay? So how can we achieve that rapid, affordable transportation? Listen to those stakeholders, have a dialogue with them, and then implement the solution. Okay, so work with the stakeholders before you make decisions. That solution may still end up being a highway, right? That's still within the realm of possibility, but perhaps it ends up being something else. Perhaps it ends up being a combination of transportation options. So this is a different model. If we take our two icons from a couple of slides ago and we switch them around, now we have the stakeholders giving input into the project, and there is more of a dialogue between the people that may be impacted and the people designing the project, the engineers designing the project. Okay, so the lines are of more equal weight. There's less top-down direction as to what the project is going to be, with limited opportunity for input. And this is, when I put together the little abstract for the talk, I realized it almost sounded like the clickbait that you see, on the side of web pages, make your communication better with this one simple trick. But it really is a very simple concept of putting the stakeholders first, putting your audience first, focusing on what their needs are, and accommodating them to the extent that you can. Of course, not every stakeholder idea can be accommodated, but at least having that mindset of, let's find out what the needs are. Let's talk directly to the people that are being affected, okay? So flipping that paradigm, making those lines a little bit more equal in weight. So when it comes to engaging stakeholders, effective communication is the name of the game. That's what we need to do. And how do we do it? And I'm going to break the rest of this talk kind of into 3 pieces. And I have this diagram to kind of help keep us organized and help you kind of follow this thread through the remainder of the presentation. The first thing we need is what I was just saying, understand stakeholder needs and concerns. And once you do that, within that envelope of knowing who your stakeholders are, what they want to hear about, what they're concerned about, choose appropriate methods of communication for those stakeholders that respond to their needs and concerns. But then all of this has to happen under this wider umbrella of having a desire to create the shared understanding. So stakeholder engagement, audience-focused communications, it's more difficult. So it's a little more intensive. It's not as easy as saying, I know it needs to be done, and telling someone, that's easy. Does that make it the right thing to do? Not necessarily. So you need to have that ethic of wanting to understand the stakeholder concerns and wanting to listen to what they are and try to work through them just try to work through them. So I'm going to take these concepts kind of one at a time, starting with understanding stakeholders. And it's important to do this because the concerns and the interests amongst project stakeholders, so I'm thinking of civil and environmental engineering projects. So, road, bridge projects, site remediation, stormwater projects. So I'm thinking of those types of projects. Among all the people that may be impacted or affected by those projects, they're all going to have different concerns. So the first thing I want to do is tell you the general public does not exist. Okay, so when you say, I want to communicate with the general public, that is not a thing. There is no one message that you could put out that will resonate with every member of the public, every stakeholder in your project. So you need to take that concept of the general public and get more granular, break that down into smaller pieces, because once you do that, you're going to realize that your stakeholders are coming from different places and they may have some very different and very unique concerns. So instead, let's take the general public and think about, okay, maybe in terms of homeowners and renters, parents, business owners, watershed groups, people who might be really interested in what you have to say, but they're just busy. Okay, how do you get through to that stakeholder group? Students, commuters, pediatricians, particularly if there is something that you're communicating that has a health component to it, pediatricians, healthcare providers, school administrators. So you need to take that concept of the general public and tease out all of those separate threads, because you will have a different message for a pediatrician than you would for a school principal, than you would for a watershed group. So when you think of the general public, instead say, all right, let me break that down. Let me get that into some smaller chunks. Now, doing this, the act of going through and understanding what concerns those individual stakeholder groups that has not always been a priority. So looking back through time, Silent Spring, 1967, that was really kind of a wake-up call on environmental issues. I know you all have heard of Silent Spring, you've read Silent Spring. Kind of up until then, the people, and now I'm going to break my own rule and say the general public, non-experts were not typically that interested or informed about environmental issues. And Silent Spring really did change that. Not too long after that, 1970, we had Earth Day, we had EPA established, we had National Environmental Policy Act signed into law, and that brought in this, this paradigm of notice and comment. Okay, so this is particularly for federal environmental projects, but some states have some similar type legislation where when there's a project or an action that might have environmental consequences, you go out, you do an assessment, you give notice to the public, and you take comments back. So that's a little bit better than ignoring stakeholders. It doesn't tend to foster dialogue because there's usually separation in time and space between when the comments come in and when they're responded to, how those comments are provided, typically the responses are written and they're very, very lengthy. So it doesn't really foster a dialogue, but it's a little bit better than just ignoring the public, ignoring stakeholders. So kind of moving on from that, is there a better way to do that? Public engagement, there's a spectrum of different options for public engagement. And there is a bit more of an effort to truly engage the public, take those two icons that I showed you before and switch them and really listen to public concern. So I don't have a date on this. I have it as in progress. So this is something that I think everyone is still working on to make it better and to make it meaningful. And to understand stakeholders, before you write a single paper, before you write a single fact sheet, you want to take a step back and think about your audience. So before you put pen to paper, no fingers on the keyboard yet, who are the stakeholders in your project? And you'll typically want to use multiple tools to try to understand. So all of those separate labels I had surrounding the general public, you want to try to identify those. Okay, so you could do that through public meetings, you could go door to door, you could read local news reports to try to understand who's interested in the area that you're working in or the topic that you're working in. And you may even use tools like EPA's EJ screen. And I don't know if this is something that any of the previous speakers, I see Nikki nodding her head, yes. Any of the previous speakers have talked about. This is a really powerful, publicly available tool. Is it perfect? No tool is perfect, but it is very interesting. So you can pull up demographic data that comes from the US Census Bureau. You can pull in environmental data from EPA's databases and get a sense as to the community, and are there areas that have particular demographic characteristics and particular environmental burdens that are significantly different than other parts of a state or other parts of the country. So this is one tool that you might use to help you identify and understand the stakeholders in a project area. And just kind of a note on that, and this may have come up already as well, I was really excited to see that the current administration is looking to take EJ Screen and build on it to develop it into a climate EJ screening tool. So taking that EJ Screen basis, and I don't know what it's going to look like in the end, adding more layers to look at climate impacts, as well as the environmental discharge and air quality data that's already in EPA's databases. So that's an exciting development, and I'll be following that to see where that goes as well. But this is a communications talk. This is not an EJ talk, but there is some crossover here. EJ Screen is helpful for understanding stakeholders that you would be communicating with. That's why I wanted to mention it. And when you communicate with project stakeholders, you do want to communicate with empathy. And one of those things that you can do is look to the past to understand the present. And again, one of your previous speakers stole my thunder with the Mapping Inequality Project. So I think you've seen this before as well. Looking to the past, understanding redlining that has happened, and why communities have been invested in or not invested in, or had polluting industries placed within their boundaries. Understanding that is really important. so that you can understand present conditions, because the effects of this, the effects of the redlining, we still see that today. And when you listen, listen with purpose, use those active listening skills. And one thing that I am, just full disclosure, something that I don't do, something that I don't teach, but I recognize it as a distinct academic field, is community engaged research. If you want to work with communities for the long term to help solve and address some really intractable problems, that's a long-term commitment, and you just need to be prepared for that. There are other people that are more knowledgeable on community engaged research than I am, people that is their research portfolio is community engaged research. I am not that person, so I just wanted to be clear about it while kind of acknowledging it as a field of study. So one thing that I can say that you would want to avoid is helicopter research. Okay, dropping into a community saying, hey, this is what I think you should do, and then leaving. Okay, so that's something that we want to avoid when interacting with stakeholders at all costs. So once you have a sense of who your stakeholders are, then we move to that inner circle of selecting appropriate methods of communication with those stakeholder groups. So I think of this as kind of going beyond the who, what, when, where, why, and how. Okay, so beyond that, those basic questions that you ask yourself before you communicate. Thinking about the context of communication. This is something that I just love understanding the context that I'm communicating in. I ask about relationships between organizations. I want to understand the past interactions, needs and wants and beliefs and power relationships, expectations. I love context. That I feel like that helps me be a much stronger communicator and develop better messages. Okay, so understanding the context, developing your message, identifying your audience. So that's what we've just been talking about in terms of stakeholder analysis, communicating with purpose, selecting the right products, putting together a communication schedule, and then having a plan to evaluate to know if you have done a good job in your communication. Okay. So kind of going back to each of these contexts, what's happening around your communication? Are you communicating, is there a conflict that you should be aware of? Is there an emergency situation? Are you coming in to try to remedy something that has gone wrong in the past? Understanding all of that context. Identifying a main message that you want to communicate to your audience, to those different stakeholder groups. What is the purpose of your communication? So you're probably not just communicating to hear yourself talk. You're probably communicating with the intent of getting someone to understand something so that they take action. Okay, so why are you communicating with the audience at this time? What's your purpose? What methods are you using to communicate? Okay, and we'll talk about some of those different methods next. How often will you communicate about, let's say, your road resurfacing project, if you're a civil engineer? Okay, so how often will you communicate? In what format? What products will you use at what time? And then how will you know that you've achieved your communication goals? And if you can think through context, message, audience, purpose, product, schedule, and evaluation, you have a solid communication plan. You are in really good shape. You understand your stakeholders. You have a plan to get the right products to specific stakeholder groups. And so this is a great start. But let's take the product piece of that and follow up on that. So you want to select communication products that are going to meet your communication goals. Okay, so different products are going to be better for different audiences. It's not one size fits all. So journals, conferences, that's probably something that you are familiar with. You're going to hit pretty much the same audience, publishing in journals, presenting at conferences, but that may not be the audience that you want to target. So you need to think a little bit broadly. And I'm trying to kind of take that approach of, how do you get your findings in the lab out to the people that need them? Okay, so journals and conferences may not get the entire job done. Social media, so you have a broader audience there. Not everyone uses social media, so you may not get to your intended audience. Mailings, okay, so you could target a geographic area and mail things to them. You could go to mass media, TV, radio, newspaper, podcasts, and that gives you an opportunity to take your findings and put some context around them, tell a story about your findings. Beyond that, there are those informal conversations, and that's something that I miss a lot, being remote, are those coffee conversations that you have, conversations over lunch where you can just catch up. And that, I think, is overlooked as a communication tool. It's time intensive, okay? So you have to be kind of prepared if you want to use those informal communications to do a lot of coffees, have a lot of lunches with people and spend a lot of time doing that. And then there are in-person formats. You could bring your research findings to a public meeting. You could have an open house and have that type of in-person interaction. But ultimately, you want to get your science, you want to get your research findings into the hands of those that need to know, the people that will be impacted, and get your research into practice. So you need to select communication products that build that bridge, from the lab out into people's living rooms. So one of the models that I'm pretty familiar with from my time at EPA is the Superfund process. And this chart is, there's no quiz, I promise. This chart, there's a lot in this chart. And this is, part of this shows you the Superfund remedial process. So kind of that long-term cleanup process from the discovery of a contaminated site all the way up to the site being remediated and removed from the NPL. Okay, so that's the Superfund process. And then what you see on either side, above and below, are the community involvement activities at each step of that process. So this is above this, this band. These are required activities. So that's where you'll see things like public notice that the site is being proposed to the NPL. Required, every site has a community involvement plan that is developed from scratch for that site, focusing on stakeholders in that site. Public meetings, fact sheets, 5-year reviews, which are kind of summary reports, public comment periods again. That's all required. And then there's a whole host of other recommended communication activities through the Superfund process. Okay, so risk communication, developing social media for the site, community advisory groups, and there are even technical advisory groups where community groups get grant funding to do their own research related to the site. That's part of the Superfund process, and it's really a unique aspect of the Superfund process. In public meetings, poster sessions, open houses, focus groups. So there are a whole host of different products that can be mixed and matched to put together a communication plan for a site cleanup. So this just kind of illustrates how all those things can come together. I mentioned public engagement earlier on. The goal here is honest dialogue with stakeholders. So you don't want to essentially overpromise in what you're able to do and underdeliver. So this International Association for Public Participation, IAP2, their spectrum gives these options for engaging stakeholders, for engaging the public. In some instances, really all you can do is inform the public. And that makes sense. If there is, putting on my civil engineering hard hat, if there's a bridge closure for emergency repairs, you don't have a whole lot of time to collaborate with the community to find the best solution. Basically, what you can do is inform them. We'll let you know what's happening as we know what's happening. But there are other situations where maybe it's more appropriate to partner with the public to help identify alternatives. And something that comes to mind here is reuse of brownfield sites. So collaborating with the public to get their input on what they want that site to be. It has been probably a drain on the community for a while. No one likes the fact that it's there. Listen to the stakeholders, collaborate with them to come up with some alternatives for reuse of that site. Okay, so you can be anywhere along the spectrum, but it's important to make that promise that they have here to the public at the right level, that you want to make a promise that you can keep, essentially. So now zooming out to that kind of the umbrella under which all of these things occur, you need a desire to create shared understanding. You have to want to do this work. Okay, so to communicate ethically, you need to communicate at the right level with your stakeholders. You need to make sure that you are answering questions that stakeholders genuinely have. So that's why it's important to understand their needs and their concerns so that you can get them the right information, packaged in the right format, delivered at an appropriate level. And even though we're not talking about risk communication today or crisis communication, there are principles of effective communication that you can apply when you're talking about risk, when you're in a crisis, or when you're in other critical situations. So following those best practices shows that you have a desire to create that shared understanding. And then finally, finding space for communication practice in engineering curricula. If you can do that, if you can get students thinking about this during their undergraduate careers, then they go out into practice having seen these things before. It's not a surprise. It's almost an expectation of their engineering practice and of the they understand that this is part of the profession. Oops. I will actually stop sharing for a second. They understand that this is part of the profession, and they're prepared to go out into the world to do this. And at Delaware, this is something that we have been able to do. We've been able to put this into our engineering curriculum. So our civil engineering undergraduates take not one, not two, but 3 communication classes. And it took some work to find some space in the curriculum for that. And then that had to be, defended up through the faculty senate as the curriculum was changed. So with that, once I get my presentation back up and running, I have a scenario that I would like us to consider. Okay, and this is the interactive part. So I will be bringing in audience participation here. All right, hopefully everyone is seeing the PowerPoint again. Yes, excellent. All right, so I have a scenario for us. There we go. So you now work for, excuse me, a company that has been contracted to develop a sampling plan, install monitoring wells, and both collect and analyze groundwater samples from a site that's being considered for to be added to as a Superfund site for addition to the NPL. Okay, and I have an example over here of a Superfund site not too far from me, just to kind of show you where it's set. We have a YMCA here, we have a park over here, we have a lot of residential area over here, there's a little creek, there's some schools. And the contaminants that you're looking for, contaminants of potential concern, these are things that have been used in the past at some of the industries that you believe are responsible for some of the groundwater contamination. And some of those contaminants are regulated, some are unregulated. And most of this community does get its water from a public water system. So the water is treated, the public water system monitors the water, the community gets those results in their annual water quality reports. So this is the scenario. Who are the project stakeholders? Who do you think? We have a community with a Superfund site. There's park, there's residential area, there's some schools, there's a daycare, there are businesses, restaurants. Who do you think some of the stakeholders in this project would be? Who would be interested in it? What do you think?
Well, I would say one of the stakeholders are the people that govern that town, the ones that are responsible for their constituents. They would be very interested in that.
Yes, elected officials always want to know about everything happening at Superfund sites because their constituents will call them and they will call EPA and say, what's going on with the Superfund site? Other stakeholders, so elected officials, absolutely.
School board members.
School board members. So this might be seen as something that would impact property values, and the property values that's tied to the school taxes that are collected. So they may be concerned for the kids and the safety of the water supply. They may also be concerned about the impact on the school district as a whole. Let's see if we can get one more stakeholder group.
The water utility?
Yeah, the water utility itself, and even the customers of the water utility could be a specific stakeholder group. Okay, so you're going to have different messages for the school board, different messages for the water utility, different messages for the elected officials. Same facts, same information, perhaps delivered a little bit differently, perhaps at different levels of technical language. Okay, so the water system can handle some more complex language than maybe the school board can, or maybe the school board, you need to understand more about who's on the school board to know at what level to rate this information. Awesome. All right, so you're the contractor. How do you engage stakeholders on this project? What do you think? You're there, you're drilling the wells, you're collecting groundwater samples, doing surveys.
If it's a localized community, you could put up flyers or hand out, like snail mail to the people that it's going to affect, because it would be important to include everyone. And I don't really know how else you'd get to them all.
Yeah, so this is, and it might depend on what phase of the project you're in. So if you're just getting started, or perhaps you're drilling wells and it requires you to block off a street, that's one form of communication. But if you're later on and you're getting monitoring results, then you might want to take a different approach to communicating that you want to share more broadly. As a contractor, wouldn't it be nice if at the beginning of the project, you could ask these questions, like when we find things, how do we communicate with them? How do we communicate that with the community? If you're not comfortable with the fact that no one has thought about this, that's a question that you can raise too, okay? So ideally, this information is not gathered and it just sits there. There's a plan to share with the stakeholder groups as you go along. One of the things that you might run into is distinguishing between finding regulated contaminants and unregulated contaminants. That's something that you can be prepared for ahead of time and develop information, responses to questions on what does it mean that you have found an unregulated contaminant? Is it a health concern? Who might be interested in that information? Develop a fact sheet for pediatricians, perhaps a slightly different version of the same information for elected officials to explain what unregulated contaminants are. The pediatricians may want to take that information and talk to their patients about it. The elected officials might want to take that information and write legislation or press EPA to start regulating some of those contaminants. And then, how do you get that data, that monitoring data, into the hands of the people that should know what you find? You'll be sharing it with the public water system, and the public water system is required to get it out to their customers. You could plan community updates. Quarterly, we'll let you know what we're doing. Okay? You could go door to door, as Vicki was saying, mailings or handing things out. So thinking about this ahead of time makes it much easier later on. And I just want to end with this quote, and I think you can plunk in engineering for science as well, but nothing in science has any value to society if it is not communicated, and scientists are beginning to learn their social obligations. So you are all clearly doing that by being here and by having this workshop series. So hopefully I've given you something that you can take and use as you move ahead in your studies and out into practice.